So here's the third video on banking, history of banking, and this is going to be about the Federal Reserve era from 1913 on. As I said in the last video, the Aldrich Commission uh, decided to, finally came out with a report in 1913, and under President Wilson, it was sent to Congress and passed. It was the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. Instead of creating a central bank owned either by the government or owned by wealthy individuals in the country, they decided to have a system that was, a mixed system. There was going to be chartered by the government, so the Federal Reserve is chartered by Congress, but it's going to be owned by the member banks. So we have that system in place today. Now, this material is in your book on pages 689, 690, 691, 692, and all the way to 693. This is material that you will be tested on eventually through pretty much FRQ type questions. So you do need to know this stuff. Could be on the AP exam also. So the Federal Reserve System, whenever we say the word monetary authorities in the United States, we mean the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. So let's get to it here on the board. The Board of Governors, there are 7 members. They're appointed for 14-year terms. They're appointed by the President of the United States with confirmation by the Senate. All in your book. You should have read that material. It should be easy to understand that part of it. The President appoints one of the 7 members to be the chairman of the board. He's chairman of the board for 4 years, even though he has a 14-year term. He or she, because Janet Yellen was chairman of the Board of Governors for a while back under Barack Obama. Currently, the chairman of the board is a guy named Jerome Powell, appointed by President Trump in Trump's first year in office. Jerome Powell is interesting because he comes into the world of banking from an education and a career in finance instead of as an economist. Most of the time, the chairman of the Fed is an economist by profession, well-respected, been around for a long time. Ben Bernanke, Janet Yellen were both professional economists. Jerome Powell has his degree in finance and is a financier. So appointed by President Trump, but interestingly enough, he has been criticized tremendously by President Trump over the past 3 years for his failure to do what Trump wants him to do in terms of lowering interest rates. But that's the whole point of this board and the way that it's set up. The Fed is an independent agency of the federal government. If you recall from U.S. history, independent agencies, the president may appoint the leaders of those agencies, but he does not have the power to remove them, and neither does Congress, except for cause, if they do something terrible, break major laws. So President Trump cannot simply replace Jerome Powell because he disagrees with Powell's policies. So Powell is independent and is going to do what's right for the financial system of the United States rather than what is politically expedient for either the president or members of Congress. And that is very important about the Fed. It's independence from the political system. It's not part of that political business cycle that we talked about in an earlier lecture and chapter. All right, let's get on to the 12 district banks owned by member banks. So you see the 12 banks in your book. If you don't have your book, you should go get it. Pause the video if you need to, go get it. I want you to be looking at page 691, and you see a map of the United States with the 12 districts clearly outlined. District number 1 is in New England. It's centered in Boston, headquartered in Boston. District number 2 is pretty much the state of New York. I believe a little bit of New Jersey may be in there, or eastern Pennsylvania may be in there, but it is centered in New York City. District number 3 is the Philadelphia Federal Reserve Bank, et cetera, et cetera. You can see all the way across the country. Notice that the first 3 districts are very small because in 1913, that's where there was a concentration of population and business activity. District number 4 and 5, a little larger, 6, 7, and 8, significantly larger, And then districts 9, 10, 11, and 12 are enormous, especially District 12, again, reflecting population patterns from 1913. They have not felt the need to redraw these district boundaries because with computer technology, the people at the San Francisco Fed are able to manage the activities of all of those states, California, Alaska, Hawaii. You see the rest of them there. All right, so each Fed has a number, the 9th district, the 10th district, the 12th district. We're in the 12th district, headquartered at San Francisco. There is a branch of the Federal Reserve in LA, actually, also. So let's see. The important things to know about this are that the Federal Reserve System is the government's bank, especially the 2nd district here in New York handles a lot of the business of the federal government. The federal government deposits all of its tax revenues and any other revenues it receives into the Fed system. The Fed manages that for them, provides checks for the federal government. The checks that we receive in the coming months for the stimulus package are going to be drawn on the Federal Reserve. Okay. So it's a central bank for the federal government. It would loan the federal government money if need be in a crisis where the federal government didn't have time to sell more bonds, etc. All right, it's quasi-public because it's chartered by the United States. The president appoints the board of governors that set policy for all of the districts, district branches, but it's owned by the member banks. So each of these banks has a board of directors for its bank district. So here in the 12th district, the board would consist of people from Bank of America, Wells Fargo, all the banks that we have here in San Diego and throughout California, Hawaii, Nevada, etc. They would sit on the board for the Federal Reserve branch at San Francisco, and they would represent the ownership. All the banks own stock in their local. So all the banks in Ohio have stock in the Cleveland branch of the Federal Reserve. And they receive dividends on their stock because the Federal Reserve banks actually earn money. They earn money because they hold a lot of bonds, the debt of the federal government, our national debt. And in owning those bonds, they receive interest payments. And the interest payments they get from those bonds, and then also the small fees that they charge to member banks who use their services, like check clearing services and the like. The Fed is a nonprofit organization, but it actually turns a tidy profit every year, and it pays dividends on the stock that is held by the member banks of each one of these 12 banks. And then it actually typically has money left over from that it returns to the Treasury of the United States. So being nonprofit means there's no profit motive for the things that the Federal Reserve does. It solely has the financial welfare of the United States in its actions. It is monetary policy. The things it does are monetary policy, which we will study in chapter 36. Okay. In a crisis, if things were to go really bad like they did in 2007 and 8, the Federal Reserve, each of these branches would lend money to the banks in their districts. So if Union Bank had been in trouble, San Francisco Fed would have lent money to Union Bank to make sure that it could cover all of its debts and its obligations. So member banks deposit their money into their local Fed district, just like a customer would deposit money into a regular commercial bank, and the Fed provides services to the member banks, just like member banks provide services to their customers, as you read in the book there. We'll talk more about the Federal Open Market Committee in a later chapter. They actually do the buying and selling of bonds. That is the process that we call open market operations. We'll study that later on. All right, the Fed functions and responsibilities. One of the functions is issuing currency. So, these are lectures that I enjoy giving every year, like I said in the announcement. And I usually pull out my wallet at this point and show a dollar bill and maybe a $5 or a $10 bill. And if I don't have anything in my wallet, I borrow one from one of the students. So if any of you have bills in your pocket right now, take one out and take a look at it. What I wound up doing is going to the internet and getting a copy of a $1 bill off the internet. Now, if you take a look at this bill here, this particular one has a B in the circle right here. And the $1 bill hasn't changed much since 1913. This is pretty close to the very, very similar style that they used starting in 1913. Around the circle there, it says Federal Reserve Bank of New York, New York. B is the 2nd District, New York. This particular bill that this is a photograph of was issued by the Federal Reserve at New York. Bills issued, most of the bills that we have in California have an L on them because they were issued by the Federal Reserve at San Francisco. We wind up getting here in San Diego a lot of different bills from all the different districts. You very well may have an 8H or a 4D or a 3C, because obviously a lot of, when people travel, they take their money with them, and the bills wind up coming to San Diego and LA and San Francisco from people who are on vacation. So we have a lot of different bills from a lot of different Federal Reserves here. The 5s, 10s, and 20s were all redesigned in the 1990s, and they no longer have the circle with the letter in it, but they do have, okay, back to this bill again, you see where it says, now that says C2, so that's not going to work, but it has the number 2, up here. So all the redesigned bills will have the number in the 4 corners on the face of the bill for the district that they were issued by. And I'm not going to go through the detail. I'll just read the list quickly. You need to read what each of these things means. The Federal Reserve sets the reserve requirements for holding reserves, which we'll talk more about in Chapter 35 and 36. Lending to financial institutions serving as a lender of last resort in an emergency, like I said, providing check clearing services. I talked about check clearing a little bit in the previous video. When you write a check, you write it to a person, they deposit in their bank presents the check to your bank and gets the money from your account to go into the person you wrote the check to, into their bank, who then deposit it into the account of the person you wrote the check to, and then your bank debits or takes the money out of your account. So that's check clearing. Check collection. Acting as fiscal agent, that's what they do for the federal government, collecting, depositing the taxes, writing the checks for the federal government, supervising banks. So no longer do Treasury agents show up to supervise a bank. Instead, the Federal Reserve has electronic surveillance, if you will, of all member banks all the time. So they're always being audited or monitored to make sure they're doing things correctly. And then finally, controlling the money supply, which is going to be part of Chapter 36 as we talk about all that. The rest of the chapter is not going to be on the test. You can read about the crisis of 2007, 8, and 9, the mortgage default crisis, the bailout through the Treasury bailout, TARP, Troubled Asset Relief Program. And if you're going to go into business, finance, or be an economist in the future, you need to know about those things. I recommend you read them. Not going to be on the test, not going to be on the AP exam, but they're very interesting things to look at. I wish I could make a video and talk a little bit about those things. So that's it for Chapter 34. I'll be making a homework Part 2 video soon.